I appreciate my family here with me, and I hope they'll chime in on some memories because they were up here when I was here. My older brother Stan's here, so hopefully he can chime in on a few of the memories. Lance sent me a few questions the other day, and as I compiled this last week, I thought to myself, I need to ask myself the question, what does Kolob mean to me, and what happened when Zion's Park started to come into the play, and why is Kolob not part of the Dixie National Forest? I've always asked myself that. I think I answered it a few years ago, but I went back and did a little more research at the courthouse. I've been in the title business my whole life, so I had the opportunity last week to go over and take a couple of days and go through the records of the county when the original transcripts from the United States of America to the state of Utah. So I thought it would be interesting to read a couple of these to you. These are my grandfather's abstracts when he bought the ranch up here. He got these two abstracts. That's the majority of what he ended up with. Uncle Gordon ended up with this piece, and Uncle Ellis Larson ended up with this piece down here, and then some sold to Hall's. But this was pretty much the ranch that we now own, these abstracts right here. So when the United States of America started to, when Utah becomes a state in 1896, at that point in time, in the charter, in every township has 36 sections. In every township, there's 4 sections that was given to the state of Utah to take care of the education of the children. And that's section 2, section 16, section 32, and 36. Those 4 sections. Now what happens is the state and the federal government got together and they would block state ground up, and they would block and they would trade federal ground. But initially the whole state of Utah was designed to be 4 sections in every township owned by the state, as I just described, and the federal government owned everything else. And then you would have people that would acquire patents through homesteads and other means. So this first transcript in 1907, it said it was given to the state of Utah for a permanent reservoir. Now this is property that's up close to where the reservoir is here. The next transcript, I'll just go through a couple of them. This is another one for a reservoir. There's 100,000 acres in this one given for the Institute of the Blind. So what happened is the United States of America and the state of Utah got together on this particular section up here. I think Utah thought this has a lot of potential for private ownership and use, so they blocked this area up, and it became about 95% of everything from the county line south became owned by the state of Utah. So then, and again, it's fairly late. We think of our pioneers got in here in the 1860s, I think down to Rockville, Springdale, St. George, 1861. But most of the patents come out from the state of Utah and most of this property in the 1919, 1917, 1918. Well, we know people were up here utilizing the ground before that. But it was pretty well open range. So the Forest Service Act comes in about 1903, 1906. Taylor grazing comes into the BLM in 1934. And prior to that, it was pretty well open country that people just came and used. There was, talking to my grandfather, I said, when it was open range, how did you not squat on everybody? And he says, well, we kind of respected, like if there was a little dairy over there in the old Lamoureux Meadow, those people kind of had that. Most of the ownership of Kolob back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, I'll read through a few of the names so you can appreciate the history of those families. They came up here with sheep herds. There was no fences. Coming in from Virgin and coming up this way was very, very difficult to get here. So the majority of the families that I see ownership were the Cedar families. The Lamros, the Joneses, the Seaveys, Williams, all of those names, they're all Cedar names. So they brought their sheep herds up here. One little record I read that they had a dairy over here in the Lamros, and they made butter, cheese, sold milk, and they sold it to the sheep. When my grandfather got here, he got here in about 1936 or 37, and he rented some ground behind where the lake is. And then he eventually ended up purchasing this property over here after the Great Depression. So the Depression ends up from about 1929 to 1939. And if I look at some of these old abstracts, you'll see all of those yellow pages. Those were all properties that were owned by Washington County. The private owners up here lost ownership of the property because they couldn't pay their taxes. They eventually, after the Depression, the county allowed them to redeem those. But throughout Washington County, during the Depression, there was a tremendous amount of the property that was ended up in the name of the county because people couldn't redeem them because of unpaid taxes. And up here, my grandfather, he always referred to this lower section down here, and where we're at is bank ground. They bought this from the Bank of Hurricane. Those people that were up here couldn't pay their mortgages, and he ended up buying some of this through the bank, and then he bought some from other parties. So Kolob, what does it mean? I don't know who originally gave the mountain its name, but it's a LDS vernacular that what I looked up, what it said, it's a place nearest to God. So anybody that loves Kolob, I think, can agree with that. This is about as near as you can get to God on this earth. So I'm going to read a few of the families so you can appreciate the history of the mountain with these family names. John Spinlove, John Seavey, James Smith, U.T. Jones, Joseph Prince, Elvin Williams, Jenny Thorley, George Spilsbury, Lehigh Jones, John Adams, William Adams, Lawrence Kleiman, Susan Nagley, Archie Spilsbury, George Williams, Lyman Seavey, Heber Seavey, Reuben Maloney, Ward Esplin, Thomas Judd, Richard Thorley, Welling Wright, Floyd Wright, Alma Wright, James Emily, John Carpenter, Clarence Lamro, Milo Blake, Gordon Blake. Those are some of the names going back to the beginning of the county records that are on public record. Now, Zion's Park was established in 1909 as a monument and eventually became a park in 1919. There was one individual, I'll tell this story, the only reason we're here today, in my opinion, is the people that came and developed this property for recreational use. I was working at the title company in 1971, and there was an individual from, and I wish I could remember his name, from Colorado that was working at the courthouse, looking up ownership of these properties up here, and his plan was to, with Zion's Park, that they'd take everything south of the county line. They had the Kolob fingers. They already had purchased this property from Ward Esplin in 1968. They bought 25 acres from him. They had taken a whole bunch of lower Kolob down there from the Spinlove family and bought it, and the Lee family, the old Evan Lee family, on lower Kolob, and they were marching north. They were planning on taking everything. They had already condemned and taken from my Uncle Gerald Blake, that my granddad and Gord used to own that property, and my Uncle Clark and Reed, they owned property underneath Lava Point. They had already taken that ground, and they were moving north. But Orville had come up here and started the development. Remember the old development right here, Stan, what was it called? Island in the Sky?
Yeah, Orville Wright.
Orville Wright, what did I say?
You said Orville.
Orville Wright. He had on the sign, own your own deer herd. He was promoting this as a golf course, and he started Woodland Retreat. The first subdivision was just south here in 1961. Then during the 70s, there was probably 7 or 8 more subdivisions created down below and over here. Well, anyway, I was talking to this individual. I didn't let him know that my family had property up here because I wanted to try to find out what he was up to. And over a course of a year or two, I visited with him when they were buying these properties, and he finally said, we're through with purchasing property up here because there's too many people. And the Kolob Reservoir, that was a deterrent too. That would have been in the middle of the park. And so the deterrent of people up here living and owning property, it was pretty easy to take it from the ranchers, but by the time you get a couple hundred cabin owners, it's pretty tough to kick them off the mountain. The other thing I think that stopped them was the development of the Kolob Recreation Association by Bill Barlocker and Jack Schultz and that group from Hurricane. So even though maybe the old timers would have loved to seen it stay the way it was, without the development, I'm afraid it would have been lost up to the county line.
Larry, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Was that condemnation a friendly condemnation, or did they actually come in and condemn for the public?
The only one that I know of that wasn't friendly was my Uncle Gerald Blake, and it was really bad. They went down there and actually burned his cabin down, kicked him out. It was a bad deal. But most of the rest of them, they had. I looked up this Ward Esplin deed, and it was in 1968, and it was like 2,300 acres they took. I think I wrote that down. Hold on just a second. Yeah, 2,342 acres from Ward Esplin in 1968. And they gave him the right to, his son was still in the cattle business, Dwayne, and they gave him the right to occupy the property and run cattle there until he passed away. Those were some of the ways. I don't know the details. Did they buy some property from the Lamros in that lower Kolob area? I think you guys held on to it.
We have one, sir.
Yeah, I think they bought Spinloves out, some have in lease. But I think on this end down here, they got fighting with Gerald Blake and some of those under Lava Point. But most of it was they negotiated a price and had it appraised, and most people knew they'd lose if they went to court anyway, so they just as well cooperate under the threat of condemnation. But I think the reason why they were in the sheep business, if you know much about sheep, they're always in a herd, so you can herd them around. There wasn't any fences to speak of back then. The difficulty of building fences and the money it took to buy wire, people would bring their sheep herds and they would try to keep them separated with their herders, and pretty much everybody was in the sheep business. Then eventually, after the war, the sheep business got pretty tough because wool became virtually worthless. After World War II, nobody's making blankets anymore. The sheep man used to say he almost made as much with his wool as he did with his meat at the end of the year. Then Grandpa always said, with your wool, you pay all your expenses and your meat is the profit. I don't know, there must not have been a lot of profit. They all went broke in the sheep business. So then they get in the cattle business. My fond memory, and Stanley can probably remember better than I because he's a little older, when we trailed the cows in the mountain. We would haul the cows to the corral that still exists right there where you hit Kolob Creek, right before you get to Virgin. You see that corral right there. We would come and haul the cows there, take a day to haul the cows there, and late in the evening we would trail the cows to the top of the hill right where under canvas is. There used to be a corral right there along the side of the road that all the ranchers around here would use, and that was the stopping point on the first stop. Then the next day we would trail them from there up to the ranch.
Larry, did
Yes.
you do that first one in one day?
No, the first day we would haul the cows to Virgin, and in the afternoon we would trail them to the top of the hill where under canvas is, and we'd put them in a corral, and we'd sleep there that night. And if we were really good and worked hard, we'd go back down to Virgin, and Dad would buy us a Pepsi down there. The gnats used to be so bad in the trees you couldn't sleep. So I can remember a couple of times Grandpa would start a tree on fire there to get the gnats away where we could sleep. And then we'd take off about 4 in the morning. Of course, the cows knew the way up here. We'd just follow them pretty much. And we'd turn the cows out of the corral about 4 in the morning. And then we would noon right there where you come into Black Canyon. We'd stop the cows and stop everything right there and let them noon and rest right there. Then the next stop would be right here in this meadow in front of the old Elroy Wolfenstein cabin, where Doug has that meadow right there. We'd put them right in there and let the cows and the calves mother up before we'd turn them loose. Yes, Wendy?
About what year was this? Was there, the road was already?
Well, you could, all of my life, I can remember we could drive up here on a dirt road, and in the late 60s, they started to oil it. But I'm not sure when they would have built that road up Maloney Hill. As soon as they got equipment and stuff to, I mean, they had dynamite, but they would have had to have had machinery. Probably in the 20s and 30s, they got machinery where they could put that road up Maloney Hill. Now, what's interesting, the old road is not there. The old road, if you come up and that sharp turn at Maloney Hill, if you'd walk off there about 150 yards north or 200 yards north, the old road used to go around there and then back up that canyon. That's the way we trail the cows up. I've gone off there a few times on a snowmobile when we would ride off the mountain that direction when we had quite a bit of snow. But that's the way we trail the cows up. And then my granddad, of course, I was not old enough when he was in the sheep business, and then he went out of the business. Then he went back into the sheep business in about 63, Stanley, probably? I was 11 or 12 years old, so I was born in 52, so I'm saying 62 or 3. So he got back in the sheep business. The cows we took up here, they shifted to the Arizona Strip, and for the next 10 years, Milo was in the sheep business. And so I had the opportunity to also trail sheep up here, and that was quite an interesting endeavor. Milo runs sheep over on the West Mountains, just on west of Bloomington, and he would trail them from up by the Apex Mine, down across Bloomington. Of course, Bloomington wasn't there. We crossed the river. We'd go down through the St. George Industrial Park, and then we'd climb up the Hurricane Rim up where the Honeymoon Trail is, and then we'd drop down at the Sheep Bridge at Virgin, and then we'd come up on the mountain. It was a long trip. Then in the fall, he would leave here and go up over, drop off Canara Mountain, head out on the Enterprise Burl Desert, rent some pastures out there to buck the sheep up, and then he'd trail them back clear down around to the West Mountain. So it was a 2 or 3 week trail. Eddie Larson was the only one longer. He was clear down by Mesquite. We would always have to come up and put the fence up early because Eddie Larson was going to bring his sheep to the mountain. He'd usually come up here about the 1st of May. A lot of times it'd be snow, and he would trail them all the way up through and across Oak Valley, across Crystal, and then he would go over in Hog 7 where he run his sheep. And then Eddie would make that trip all the way, and they'd loop that around. Sheep business, they love to, in the sheep business, they love to be out on the trail because then they're eating somebody else's feed. They weren't even growing. So they moved awful slow when they were moving sheep. But with sheep on the mountain, you could keep them together where cows, Kelly can tell us how hard it is when you get a cow that gets away from you one time, then you're in trouble. You may not get it off. But back when we trailed cows to the mountain, they used to go off this way because they knew how to come back up and down the mountain. Nowadays, you haul them up and they get away from you and they end up heading downhill and end up down the Virgin Flats or end up dead because they're not smart enough to go back down the road. Anyway, I've probably taken too much time there. Now the lumber part of it. Down to Maloney Hill, and that little area right where you start off the Wildcat Trail or the Subway Trailhead, they had some sawmills down there, and the Maloneys were involved. That's why we call that Maloney Hill. They patented that ground down there. I looked at some of the old deeds, the Lee family and the Maloney family, and prior to this fellow by the name of Carpenter owned a ton of property down in that area that eventually sold it to Evan Woodbury. When Stan and I were boys, that road used to go from that area they called Little Pine Valley all the way around to Lava Point. And then there was a road that went right down here, that went right in front of Joe Priest's cabin, and loops down around these cabins that are on the side of the hill, and drop that road off to Shell Point by Lance where he built his little seat and stuff. Most of them been down there. That road was an excellent road because they were hauling timber out of there probably during the 50s and the early 60s. There was a guy by the name of Vaudry that had a sawmill that bought lumber from Uncle Gordon and Milo down in that area. That's about all I know about the lumber business. I know they had a couple of mills underneath Lava Point, but they did harvest quite a bit of lumber here, probably in the 50s and the 60s, and earlier on that lower section. Do you know anything more about that?
I was just gonna share, because it awes me that in 1877, up at Crystal Springs, Langston's, Dennett's, Hap Stout, it's all folks from Rockville. Crystal Springs actually had a logging mill there, and somehow they got the lumber back down.
They went down this way.
To Rockville. That's the stories, and she would, Alice Esom was another name there, and she writes stories. I've posted them on Preserve Kolob. I'll post them again sometime if you read those stories. But just amazing to me that in 1877, that Oak Valley Road was there, and they went all the way out to Crystal Springs and had a mill up there and brought lumber out of there.
Well, finding lumber was always a difficult project, you know, going clear out on the Arizona Strip and hauling it in and clear up into Pine Valley and up in Zion. So they had timber available up here, and I'm sure it was a commodity as long as they could get to it that they appreciated. The next question I asked, when did development and recreation begin on the mountain? I think I've already talked a little bit about Orville. But some others that were developers up here, Elroy Wolfenstein, Rex Jackson, and Howard Carter purchased a lot of this over here up north in what we used to call the old Ellis Larson Ranch. He bought that from them. And then down here in the association, you had Jack Schultzen, as I mentioned before, and Bill Barlocker. Bill Barlocker, actually looking at the deeds, bought this first. He bought it in the name of B&E Securities. That was he and Lee Esplin bought that first and then deeded it to the Recreation Association. How long is your family history on the mountain? So I'll go back. Milo and Alina Blake came up here in the late 30s, and they bought their first property they bought in 1941. And then they purchased it from 4 different individuals. They purchased some from Seavy's, they purchased some from John Spinlove. There was another Seavey family they purchased some from, and then they bought some in this lower section down here from the Bank of Hurricane. So we were up here in the sheep business. Dad and the family, when they would move up here, they moved here for the whole summer. He would bring the sheep herd up, he'd bring the whole family up, and they'd live the summer up here. When Stan and I and Nancy and Kelly, when we were up here, we were just up here maybe a week at a time, and then Dad had the farm to take care of and the ranch out on the strip, so he'd go back and forth. Back then, Milo had his whole sheep herd, so he would move the whole family. Some of the memories Dad had up here was, of course, there was very few families. Even when Stan and I and Nancy and Kelly were up here, the Bowers family would see them over here. We'd see Clarence and Donald Lamro. We would see Winford Spinlove, and we would see the Beatties, what was his name? Reed Beatty, that run the Spilsbury Ranch, and then the government trapper, Orrin Adams. Did we see anybody else down?
Seavies.
Yeah, we'd see Heber Seavey and Russ Seavey.
Orville Wright, not here then?
Well, he's one of the developers. I'm talking the ranching families. Orville was up here starting these developments at that point in time. But those ranching families, a lot of people said, well, was there fishermen up here? I think we saw Doug Allred and Clark Houston come up a few times, and then a few guys from Cedar City, but the Blake family kind of had the lake to themselves. We fished every night, and Orrin Adams, he fished every night, the government trapper. But we kind of had the lake to ourselves. We didn't see many people. It was pretty much just a little one-lane road, and very, very few people would come from St. George. You would see a few Cedar people, but mainly just the ranching families. Dad had a little Honda 50, and it was only 50cc, but Stan and I'd get on it and we'd roam around. When we'd come to the hill, the guy that wasn't driving had to jump off and run to the top of the hill, because the 50cc wouldn't go up the hill. We wished we had a trail line in Honda, but we didn't.
And Larry, what,
Thrifty Honda 50.
It was Honda 50,
That's
that's
what they say, that's how they advertise it, nifty, thrifty Honda 50.
and it didn't have much power.
and where was that?
Okay, where you turn into my cabin, or where Nancy's cabin is, where you turn into Gordon's Getaway, there was a little road that went down, and there was a little cabin down in the trees right there. And the reason why Grandpa built it there is he was able to pipe the water. There was a little spring in the horse pasture, and he piped it down so he had live water. Of course, it was just an outhouse. And it hadn't been lived in for, we stayed in it when they came up together, the cows, or worked the sheep. But that was the first year that we came up, like I say, about 64. Stan and I had the opportunity, we'd get up here, and if we were going to stay a week, we normally would go get a little fork-horned deer, and we would then have some venison to eat. We would catch some fish at night, we'd have fish to eat. Dad wasn't a very big hand for fish, but Mom used to bottle a lot of fish, and I'm sure we had a lot of bottled stuff, fruit and different things like that with Mom. But after 3 years of that, Mom put her foot down and told Dad if she was coming back again, that he had to build her a cabin. So the last summer we were up here full-time, Stan and I pretty much, and the younger kids, we went over where Nancy's cabin is, Mom and Dad's old cabin, and we grubbed that out with a pick and shovel. We never had any equipment. And the first summer we poured the floor, and Dad got some guys from St. George to come up and frame it up that fall. And then the next year, Stan and I and Gerald Blake came up and kind of finished the inside with paneling and the, what was the Sullivan guy from Hurricane that was, can't think of it, he did the plumbing for us.
Dwayne.
I think that was who it was. He did the plumbing for us. But Dad had to haul up, we had to haul up the gravel and to make the cement floor on a 2.5-ton truck. We had to shovel it off and shovel it in a little hand mixer. It was quite a project. But we got the cabin built in a couple of years. I've got a list of, I think it cost him a total of $2,500 of material and labor that he hired. The rest of it was just the sweat off the back of his boys and himself for building. So that was some of the memories we had in coming up here. Probably my favorite thing was fishing. We went virtually every night to the reservoir and fished. And then Orrin Adams, it was fun to go up by him. He taught us how to fish by putting a bubble and putting a fly on the end of the bubble. Remember, Stan? And that was probably our favorite way, because we didn't have worms or didn't have power bait or that kind of stuff. So we fished a lot with a fly on the end of just a casting rod. We were too young and didn't know how to run a fly rod, but we could put about a 6-foot leader with a fly on it with a bubble half full of water, and we were pretty successful at catching fish that way. What was the typical day as a child? I think I told you that. We would leave in the morning, we would catch the horses, ride down underneath or walk, work on the fence, come back about 3 or 4. We would ride our little motorcycle. I'm not sure what Mom did with the younger kids. That would have been hard for her too. How old was you, Nancy, and Mary Ann?
Well, when the cabin was finished, I was 12, but I remember carving my initials in almost every tree in the mountain.
Well, Mom had to deal with the kids while Dad and Stan and I were down underneath, so she probably has some stories there, or Nancy and Kelly could probably remember some of that. We stayed in that old cabin until we built the new cabin. How long did it take? These are some of the questions, Lance. How long did it take to drive to Kolob in the 60s? I would say it was at least an hour and a half from Virgin to get to this 20 miles. It was probably a 10 or 15 mile deal.
In the back of a pickup, in the back of a cattle truck.
The girls rode the front.
No.
That's the way I remember it.
Mary Ann and Mom.
And a lot of times the one Lane didn't sleep out in bed in the truck for a moment.
That was a cattle's bed, by the way. It wasn't a nice pickup. Orrin Adams, I want to talk about one of the funnest things that we all loved to do up here was deer hunt. That was probably our favorite thing as young, was when the deer hunt. We would come up and there was deer camps all over this mountain. And the deer were thick. So Orrin Adams was a government trapper. And I can remember as a boy, he claimed he would catch about 50 lions a year in this lower section of Kolob, and then he trapped in the upper section too. He'd also catch a few bears every year. We have had bears in here, and there's still a few. But we would have, the Lamros had a deer camp that they run two different sets. One the first weekend and one the second weekend. How many hunters would you guys have? Probably 50 a section? 25. Ward Espen run a big deer camp with that group. Gordon and Milo had a deer camp in this section right here, and then the Spilsburys had a deer camp up there. And we harvested so many deer, and nowadays you look around and drive around the ranch, we're lucky to see a couple of forkhorns. So we've got so many lions and predators right now that our deer herd's in pretty sad shape. Back then, with the trapping of the government trapper, and then I know my granddad, he used to have traps out all the time, and all the other sheep herders. So we had the varmints pretty well eliminated up here, so the deer herd and the amount of money that these people made off the deer camps was quite a deal for those people back in those days. But I, as a kid, I always looked forward to coming to deer camp and spending a few days and hunting deer. Still do, but we don't have the deer hunting we used to. And then as an adult, I built my cabin in 1972. I still love to come to the mountain to hunt deer.
Larry.
It's more.
92.
92, thank you, Janine. really off base there. But back when we were young, we'd come to the mountain, there was a lot more freedom. Nowadays, we come up here and we're the adults, so we have to do the adult things. What's the questions you might have? That's what I remember about the mountain. Yes, ma'am.
Larry, a question about this. You can see some rock and brick and stuff where the dairy was. And I know you're a little bit older than me, so maybe you'll remember some of this.
I think a week. 2 weeks.
4 days.
4 days.
But could you mention just a little bit more about that? Because, most people see that in the meadow right there, but they don't know what was there. It looks like maybe it's part of a chimney or something stuck out in the grass.
I mentioned that, and we'll ask Brother Lamro, maybe, do you know who was actually running that dairy there? Because
I'm not sure. I know my aunts and my grandma used to make cheese and stuff like that at one time. And where you see the rocks off, that's a sheep dip. And the reason they call it the buck pasture is after that, everybody comes to the sheep, they put their bucks in the city acres here. And then they dip the sheep because the ticks used to be so bad. I remember getting up there when I was a little child and you sit up on the table and my mom would go through the crawl.
So that's why it looks like a ditch right
Yeah,
there.
I remember one time when they do that, they have a big dip, they run the sheep and they have this big old hole and shove their heads into the water and come back out.
I thought that was a manger, but that's a dip.
That's a dip.
And I just assumed that with those remnants that looked like a chimney there, that may have been also where they had their dairy earlier than that.
Actually, I don't know about it, but I know that where the ditch is was the.
Now this is going back into the very early 1900s, 1800s, before your dad owned it.
Yeah.
I pulled up online and there was a story from a Reeves lady that talks about her coming from Rockville and moving the whole family, and they had run their cattle right there. And so, but that's interesting. They had a sheep. The buck pasture, my granddad said that they used to run their bucks in there. Is why they call that the buck pasture. So, yeah. Well, any other questions on the mountain?
When the reservoir first got started, who started putting the fish in the reservoir? Was that part of the wildlife
I'm sure just
conservancy? Or?
the fishing gang decided that was a viable source, and started to stock it. They never have stocked it a whole lot. They've tried to utilize it as a fishery where those fish go back up that stream and spawn. But as they've drained it down a few times, they've had to stock some fish. But Wendy?
Okay, I have a question, and maybe it's more of a Nancy answer, but Blue Springs, where did they get their water from, and when was that started, and was that your parents? Yeah.
The spring is still there, and that's the one that they still use. It's just down from where our cabin is, right in the middle of the Bill Lewis property.
So it goes under the
Yeah.
road there.
When you see in that little dip, and you can see into the lake, and you look down on the west side, and you can see that spring running. It used to run real heavy, but we're
Not as much snow anymore, is there? Pretty well snowing. What's interesting about that, I did a little research, I pulled that out. My granddad always said this area where your cabin is, and all that area down there is owned by a guy by the name of Doc Thorley. So his actual name is Richard A. Thorley. And he owned most of that area above the buck pasture and all down around the association. And then he ended up, there was a guy by the name of Workman that owned a tremendous amount of that ground down there too. And then Ervil Sanders. Who in here knew Ervil Sanders? So Ervil ended up owning that and then sells it to B&E Security, which was Bill Barlocker. He built him a cabin there and a runway and had an airplane, and then got together with Jack Schultz, and then I think that's the group that started the association reservoir. And I think they ended up with 275 acre-feet of water they were able to impound with that original reservoir they got from the state of Utah and built it. Anyway, those are the few things I looked up in the public record on that particular piece of ground. I want to tell one more story about this right here that my dad told me. So Archie Spilsbury was in the purebred business, and his son was LeGrand. Most of you from America knew him. He ran the mortuary. And grandson Ted's still up here, and Mona Lowe, which was Archie's daughter. And so anyway, they were in the purebred cattle business, and he had bought a herd of about 40 cows to bring up to the mountain, and he was trailing them up, and he let them water right here at Big Cliff. There's a plant, larkspur, that's very poisonous to cattle. We worry about it. I know up above the lake, the Spilsbury and the Lowes always worried about the larkspur in the spring. Cattle start to eat it, they're going to die. And I guess the larkspur was really bad on this hillside that particular spring. And those cattle were really hungry, and they dove into that feed, and there was a lot of larkspur. Well, ended up killing most all the cows. They died right here on the spot. Got sick and died. And if any of you remember the name of Kent Bentley down in St. George, he was a young man. He came up and skinned every one of them for their hide. And Dad said, stink, the whole mountain smelled all the time. They don't no equipment to get rid of them, but they just sat here and rotted away on this bench right here. So those were tough times when they couldn't get equipment up here, and we think it's as convenient as it is now. It wasn't.
Question there. So obviously snowmobiles came in the 70s, and this mountain, it's my favorite time to be up here on a snowmobile. Pre that, was anybody even up here in the winter? I mean, was
So I'll tell you a snowmobile story. Blaine Wood had...
We all have them.
Blaine Wood had 2 or 3 snowmobiles, along with a guy by the name of Blaine Jones. And some of you may know Lyle. He still has and Blaine and Mary's got a burial plot right here. So I was in high school. I think I was a junior in high school, so it'd be about 68, 69. And those snowmobiles weren't real dependable back there. But we had a cabin, and Blaine Wood had a cabin over here, so there was 4 boys and 2 adults. We started out, I think, with 4 snowmobiles, maybe 5. We ended up to the cabin up there with 1 that was still running. So we dug down into the cabin and got in the door, and we stayed that night, and I still remember we met on the snow, and we had an old, to do our dishes and whatever we were doing, wash up, we had just a metal pan. And we went to bed that night, and that next morning, that metal pan, it was solid ice. Cold and miserable. So we spent all day, we had some snowshoes and stuff with the stuff. We had that one shuttling people back down, but it was an all-day affair to get us back down below Maloney Hill to the trucks. And then I don't know how many days it took them to come up and get those machines running. But that was my first. And then later on, Janine and I bought some snowmobiles when we had younger kids. I had a lot of fun with them for, 7 or 8 years, and then I haven't done it since.
Prior to that, though, there probably wasn't.
Prior to that, I don't know of too many people that were up here with the snow machine and snowcat. I know that Mervyn Cox had a snowcat, came up quite often, and Elroy Wolfenstein, he had snowmobiles and used them a lot.
Joe Priest.
Who's what?
Joe Priest.
Okay.
First stayed up here year round.
Yeah. Yes, Wendy?
Does anybody know what the record snowfall is for here?
I don't know of a record, but I remember when we were snowmobiling, there was a basketball standard down there by the old runway in the association. We were snowmobiling down there. And the backstop, we had to be careful because we couldn't see that backstop. We knew where it was, and it was just maybe 6 inches out of the snow. So there was, that'd be 13 feet of snow on the level.
Clarence Bradshaw's daughter gave me a picture of Nancy's cabin, my dad's cabin. The only thing you could see is that upstairs window.
Really?
So I'm thinking in some of those real heavy years, well, right here, we used to snowmobile over the top of this. This was completely covered up. Probably 12 or 13 feet on the level.
Is that why this leaks?
Good Larry Bill.
Could be. So,
Well, we got any other last questions? We've got an hour in. Really
We've got an hour
appreciate you,
in.
Larry. This has been wonderful. I think pretty much unanimous. We'd like to do this again with others. I know Nancy.
And Mike and.
Yeah. So if you're interested or have others that might be interested, let us know. I wanted to give a little something to Larry here for his time today.
thank you very
So
much.
this is a map. At Kolob days, we raffled one off, but this is a map of this area right here in 1877. So it shows where the old road was. It shows Maloney Hill in the old location. It shows that the road used to come on that side of Home Valley Mill. And it does show cabins. 1877 just is crazy to me that people were up here, like you said, back when it was open range and had cabins.
The road was on that side of the buck pasture.
The road, it shows that the road was actually pretty much where Whispering Pines Road is where it went. It went straight up, and obviously at that time there was no reservoir. But anyway,
Thank you very much, Lance.
Thank you so much.
I'm gonna leave that somebody wants to look at.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.